Is masculinity good and virtuous? Are we in a period of disinflation? And should Trump's indictment concern all of us? We'll talk about these takes and more on today's episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the podcast where we gather takes from all across the internet, highlight the ones that are good. We try and reinforce what they're doing and what they're saying and the arguments they're making. We also try and pick apart the ones that we think are bad and point out where they've gone wrong and how they could have made a better argument. My name's Britt, and I'm here with my co-host Donnie. And before we get started, make sure to like, share, subscribe. We're on Instagram at Good Take, Bad Take Pod and on Twitter and YouTube at Good Bad Take Pod. And without further ado, let's get into some of our takes. The first one comes from Thomas Bassett. And is he the host of the podcast you told me about?
No. He had read an early copy of the book that this is referring to by Nancy Pearcey.
Got it. So Nancy Pearcey wrote a book, and he's tweeting about it. And he says, "For me, the big takeaway from this book is that contrary to today's narrow, truncated, and often heinous ontological assumptions about masculinity, it is not toxic, let alone synonymous with immorality. Masculinity is inherently good and synonymous with virtue. We should be grateful for Christ-like men, for it is in Jesus Christ we find masculinity as God designed it. We must root masculinity in the right worldview, as Francis Schaeffer would say." What do you think?
So this is a great synopsis of some of the points that she's making in the book. The book isn't out yet. I was listening to an interview with her about it, and I have pre-ordered it, so I'm very excited. But there's a lot of interesting things when we talk about marriage, and the word particularly masculinity, and it's very funny because it's kind of like the cultural Marxists and progressives who try to move beyond traditional Christian values will start by demonizing a phrase or a value or a word, right? So this idea of toxic masculinity, and then there's a lot of pushback, right? Because guys are like, what are you talking about? This is ridiculous. Why are you calling what it is to be a man ridiculous? And then they will then take and say, well, there's such a thing as non-toxic masculinity, but you have to understand it within our specific, what counts as not toxic masculinity. And then they'll say, having to embrace every progressive virtue is what counts as not toxic masculinity. When in reality, what they have defined as masculinity is never what masculinity was about to begin with. And that's the bait and switch that they play with you, is they start by and redefining the term masculinity and saying, wow, all of these things are bad. And therefore, people who want to buy into an idea of traditional masculinity are scared to, because they're being told it's toxic and bad. And then in order to embrace what is not toxic masculinity, you have to forfeit all of the virtues of the past and accept the new mores of the progressive. So for instance, one of the things that she talks about is when you talk about like what sort of the ideal, I don't remember the phrase she used, but when you ask people to define like what a good person is, like if a man's having a funeral, right? And someone's saying he was a good man, you ask people to define that, and they will define it. They'll say, full of honor, integrity, caring for others, protecting others, looking out for people, being truthful, those kinds of things. And then you say, okay, how do you define when someone says man up? They'd be like, oh, be overbearing, be assertive, brash, and so that's what they've done, is they've taken it and they take all of the negative tropes of what masculinity is, and then they say you can't embrace any of the traditional roles of man because that's what it means, even when that's never what masculinity has been or been about. So that's one of the aspects of this, and I think he kind of distills that in this take here very well.
Yeah, to add on to your point, right? So, like you're saying, they describe a man as honorable, or I guess as good, faithful, diligent, all these sorts of things, a good friend, and then they'll, like you're saying, they'll co-opt the language and say, well, masculinity actually means these ugly things. And then anyone that actually even uses words or says like, well, I just adhere to being, masculine, which means I want to have a culture of honor in my household. They'll say, well, you're still being toxic, right? Because they kind of merge them. And so suddenly words like, and behaviors like honor, faithfulness, things like that, are saying like, oh, I want to be monogamous. I want to be with a woman that is faithful to me. All those things become toxic. They're able to lump them all together at the same time. And the unfortunate thing about this is that you actually get more men as a backlash to that being like, well, they have a hole and a void in their soul, which all men desire to be capable of something, right? Like it's I think it's at Wild at Heart, John Ortberg talks about how every single man's desire is to answer the question of, am I capable of doing this, right? Do I have what it takes? And in the proper context, which is, do I have what it takes to protect, nourish, feed, care for my family and my wife and everyone, and lead them in the way that they're supposed to be led, and all these things. That's when it's good. But when you suddenly strip that away and you tell men and boys that, like, oh, that's just symptoms of toxic masculinity and that's bad, you need to be opposite of that. You can't deny the nature of man, which is the desire to do something like that. And so what happens is you get people like Andrew Tate, people like Justin Waller, these guys that are able to prey upon that desire and be able to be like, well, like, yeah, like I do have honor and all this stuff. And also, yeah, like you should have honor, but I'm also going to sleep around with a lot of women. I'm going to have a cam girl business. One of my favorite moments in that whatever podcast, I've just seen clips of it, but of the clips that I've seen, is Lila Rose from Live Action, which is a pro life organization, is on there with a guy named Justin Waller, who's kind of like a Andrew Tate light. And she basically is like, hey, like I really respect that you are disciplined in business, that you take care of your body and you work out, that you are really faithful to go to bed and do all these things on time, and you careful about what you eat. But I think it's like weird to me that you like will not be monogamous with a woman. Like, don't you think that's like, shouldn't you take control of everything else in your life, but you're not taking control of this aspect of it, yet you would demand it from any woman that you were with? And he's just like, well, it's just not how I was wired. And she totally goes in and destroys him. It's like, well, that's not an excuse. That's the antithesis of the reason you do all these other things that you're in control of. And so that the feminists and the people that have destroyed masculinity, that really harp on it, it's no excuse for people like Andrew Tate and Justin Waller existing, but you've created the holes and the voids in the hearts of men and boys that desire honor by telling them, hey, you can't be honorable without being toxic. So now that these not these bad actors can come in and now kind of have a say in these kids' lives that they shouldn't have, because you've made everything just so hard to touch.
I love how you defined all of that, and in particular, the nature of man to want, can I do that? Because one of the other things that was pointed out, that she will point out in this book coming out, and looked at studies, is that there's a lot of assumption about, oh, guys are just naturally, naturally wild at heart, and they're just always susceptible to their vices, and that's just how guys are. And that wasn't the assumption really for most of civilization. Most civilization was morality is a rational choice,
Hmm.
and men are tend to be better at making rational choices. So men actually are, between men and women, are more likely to be naturally more moral because they will rationally choose the good. And only until sort of this Darwinistic evolutionary theory started being propagated was it this, oh, well, that's actually man's base nature as being an animal. And so I think that men do have a natural nature of restlessness, but I don't think it's animalistic necessarily. I think
Mm.
we're all fallen. We all have, a disposition towards sin, but it's not this kind of like, oh, boys are just, they're gonna go out, they're gonna sleep around, they're gonna rape people. Like that's just how guys are. That just wasn't a thing until we kind of divorced the idea of men being made in God's image, just as like women, right? But like having this virtuous strain in their DNA. And the other thing too, when we talk about this, and sort of the divide between what is toxic masculinity, and so many people will cite. Oh, I just have to shout out, by the way, my mom sent this podcast, so shout outs to her because it was super interesting, and I'm really, really sort of like interested in this, and so I'm grateful for that. But anyway, so another really fascinating thing about this, they will say, well, you can see toxic masculinity is high in traditional households, right? Because you look at divorce rates, and Christians are just as likely to divorce as secular people, and you'll look and say abuse is really high in religious households. But the problem with those studies is they haven't done their work. They've just lumped anyone who identified like Baptist or Christian. If you actually dig into the studies a little bit more and ask identifying Christians and find out who nominal Christians are versus not nominal Christians, Christians who go to church every Sunday, who spend time praying with their families, reading the Bible, doing things that actually are fruits of being a faithful servant of Christ, those people the faithful ones are way higher. The divorce rates are extremely low for them. Women asked in interviews in separate rooms from their husband are way more likely to be happy than not, and they stay together much longer and better. Conversely, the nominal Christians are way worse than their secular counterparts.
Hmm.
So what ends up happening is you look at the stats for secular people and it's like 50%, and then you look at the Christians and the nominal Christians are so much lower that they balance out the high, continued marriage and happy rates of faithful Christians. So it looks like they're even in 50-50. But in reality, the nominal Christians are way worse than secular Christians. And one of the theories Nancy Pearcey kind of posits towards this is that, and I think that your example of like Andrew Tate and these people who come in to fill the void really perfectly personify this. They will they take sort of the terminology and the blank misunderstandings of what biblical marriage and masculinity is, where it's like the man is the leader of the household, right? And then they apply sort of the secular understandings to that, which is making all the decisions, not
Yep.
consulting the wife, domineering, all that kind of thing. And then they have a religious justification because they say, well, the Bible says that. Now, they're not actually religious, but they are nominally religious. And so they feel they have that permission to go overboard. Whereas a secular person might kind of still feel guilty, even though because they don't have sort of a blank check to act in those ways, because what I would argue is the natural law written on your hearts. Whereas the people who think or contrive a way to say that they have religious permission for this just act out in that way without any holds barred. So absolutely fascinating stuff. But so I think it's one of the biggest um falsities is that, traditional masculinity is driving divorce rates, it's increasing abuse, and that is just not the case. It's the complete abuse of what masculinity is, and the secular understanding, not the traditional understanding and not the Christian understanding.
Yeah, I don't have any more to add. That was fantastic. Let's move on to our next one. We've got Paul Krugman, economist extraordinaire, and he tweets out, "It's getting hard to deny significant disinflation happening, despite unemployment close to historic lows." And he posts a chart that shows basically like the inflation rate or the CPI. I mean, excuse me, the CPI over the past 6 months, I believe. And it kind of goes up a little bit. It goes really far down, and it climbs really high, and then it's starting to go down now. Is what it's looking like. And I'll let you take it on.
I guess I'm confused as to at what rate he thinks that this is actually happening. I mean, the the big picture would be that we're still we're still way higher than we were. I think it's probably more helpful to zoom out
Probably
quite a
12 to
bit.
24 months would
Yeah,
probably be the right
exactly.
way.
Yeah, you can cherry pick your dates and make it like, oh man, it increased and decreased. But the other thing is like, I don't think that these numbers have ever been particularly accurate when you look at the actual inflation rates based on what they're saying. I can't remember the numbers they were claiming, but when you actually looked at how the inflation was impacting Americans, it was closer to like 6 percentages higher than what they were claiming the actual inflation rates were. And so when they're talking about, disinflation occurring, I don't buy that, because I don't think the numbers have been accurate to begin with. It's certainly not reflected in the lives of most Americans, and with the way that the Fed is going, you might have a temporary decrease in increased spending, right? Not an actual decrease in spending, but a temporary decrease in the amount of increase. But I also don't think that that's anything significant or substantial, and that we've kind of raised the baseline, regardless of what cherry picked data shows here. It's not a convincing argument at all.
Yeah. What the part that was really funny to me is that, I mean, even in this chart on the top, there's a disclaimer that says this is the CPI excluding food, energy,
Yeah,
shelter, and used cars. And to be fair, right, if you pulled this chart up, because I looked at it without with those included in it, the shape of the line is about the same. But like you were saying, and quite wisely, is that you got to pull this thing out, right? Like let's think about why we have so much inflation in the past 3 years. We shut down the economy, and then most of all, we printed trillions and trillions of dollars. So we produced less stuff, and we had more money chasing those goods, which caused inflation. So, like, in any accurate understanding of the actual situation we're in and whether it's getting better or not, needs to be looked at in the scope of the past 3 years. It's very similar to like, I don't know if you've ever seen these people that will do like visual representations of the United States debt, and when we cut like we'll cut like $200 billion off of the debt. And people will be like, yeah, like this is the equivalent of like having a whole like shelf full of pennies upon pennies upon pennies all stacked on top of each other. And then you have like you remove two pennies basically out and then said, oh, I did a good job reducing the debt. It's like, yeah, you have to look at it within context of the larger problem. And the fact of the matter is that like we are way worse off today than we were 3 years ago. So any little dip, that we see in the CPI, like sure, I guess you could technically say this is disinflation in some ways, but is it in any meaningful manner? And on top of that, the actions that the Fed took to kind of help, you know, slow down the inflation was to raise interest rates, and they've stopped raising interest rates now. So you and I don't believe in centrally controlled interest rates. We believe that money should flow freely, that the market should determine what the interest rate is, based. And when we say the market, we mean individual banks and lenders and people like that, because they're the best people that can decide whether they want to risk a lot or not risk a lot. So when the Fed kind of got it right, like based on market conditions, based on where things need to be, like, hey, we need to raise the interest rates. But the fact of the matter is, they have not raised it anywhere near what it needs to be to actually truly bring down inflation to what it was pre 2020 levels. As and not to mention anything beyond that further backwards. So, yeah, this is not evidence that Biden is doing a good job. This is not evidence that the current strategy is working, or that not even that the strategy is working. It's evidence that like there are things that are working about it, but the mindset that caused all this stuff has not been addressed. It's still there. We're still going to have plenty of issues. The inflation rate and the CPI is a lagging indicator. So all the money we print right now, and we printed the past 6 months, those effects aren't seen until a lot later.
Yeah, yeah, that's a phenomenal point. The other, I mean, like, if you were to think about how much interest rates should be raised, like the massive increase you have from what, the April of 2020 to 2022 would
Doubled.
be, yeah, double clearly. And we would also say that you probably shouldn't stop it arbitrarily now
Hmm.
either, right? There's no reason why that should be done in an economical sense. As my coworker Todd Myers always says, like, science never works in like divisibles by 10. Science never works in round numbers, kind of a thing. And to me, it's like when the Fed just kind of arbitrarily says, okay, now it's time to stop raising interest rates. I'm like, this is a political decision. It's
Yep.
not. It's not ever financially. They might try, like, at best they might try to run these financial calculations, but there's no actually, if they're doing what their purported job would be, which is measuring out what the interest rates for money should be, they're not doing that job. They're doing a political job here. That is what they are doing. Whether or not you think it's right because you want to like spur the economy this way or that way, if you're so bought into this Keynesian mind, suck, that you think they can actually control that, that's fine. But you also have to recognize that it's not done based on the reality of what they're supposed to be doing, which is setting the interest rate of what money is worth. And that's so that's kind of the other funny thing is, like, you can that you can say that, oh, there's significant disinflation happening, in the same way that you could say that, like, oh, well, if you look at the flooding that's going on in the basement, the flooding has significantly stopped ever since we hooked up the vacuum cleaner to dump the water into the other room, and the vacuum cleaner is flooding at a lower rate than this is dumping into the other room. You can arbitrarily show data and stats, and change and manipulate them and change them if you want, but you still have to live with the consequences of that. And what are the consequences of this downward trend of disinflation? Well, it's like it's like sealing off a release of gas where the pressure is just building elsewhere. And so if you stop the interest rates now so that you have this, quote unquote disinflation, you're only going to make the bubble worse later, which is just the entire story of the Federal Reserve and
Yeah.
America's monetary supply since we got off the gold standard. And so all he's doing here is showing, like, oh, look, we've gone down in the last like year or something a little bit, and we've also arbitrarily stopped raising interest rates, which will need to be raised again in the future, so that number will have to go up again.
Yep.
That's all you're kind of, it's like, hey, you have to admit it. You have to admit it. It's like, okay, but that doesn't say what you think it says.
Yeah. I really liked your point about the arbitrariness of how they've decided, like, oh well, now it's time to stop raising interest rates, just points to the fact that it is politically motivated. And I was listening to Peter Schiff and Jordan B. Peterson talk about just overall economics and everything, and he was like, can you just lay out to me your understanding of the Fed and why it affects things the way it does and why it's gotten us in the situation that we're in today? And Peter Schiff had a fantastic response in that he's like, look, politicians, their time horizon is around a year of how they think. Now, even though they're in office for 4 years, it's really the year before their reelection bid comes up. They want to make sure everything is going really well and seems really good because that's really the year that matters for them to continue getting paid for 4 years. So they got to do a quote unquote good job, or at least make their constituents feel like they're doing a good job and they're happy, or that they should be, disenfranchised against their opponent during that time. And so what that means is in the year leading up, they want to borrow as much as they can. They want to put all their chips on a certain thing, leverage all the resources with no consideration for the future. And so is it any coincidence, right? We're about a year out from 2024. We've got all these interest rates going up. It makes it really painful for Americans in a lot of ways, because we're like, well, now we can't borrow money to buy things that we shouldn't actually be able to afford. That's what low interest rates do. Low interest rates make it easy to borrow money for things that you can't afford. People and constituents really like it because they feel like they're able to be really rich, even though they've never actually created anything or earned anything or generated any value. And so the reason we've had such low interest rates for so long is because it's just easy to do that. Let's just keep them low. People that make not enough money to buy $1 million house can now buy $1 million house. So, anyways, to figure out inflation, though, they had to raise them a bit. They raised them to 7%. And it kind of is starting to curve it a little bit. Now that we have a little bit of a dip, it's like, okay, now we've got enough breathing room that we can lower interest rates again and fool the American people into thinking that they've got it good. But we don't. We need to raise it quite a bit more because we've been living beyond our means for so long. I don't know how much that raise needs to be. You don't know how much it is. No one actually knows, but we know that it needs to go a lot higher. And I mean, for contrast, when my parents bought their house in 1990, the interest rate that they bought at was 12%. Right. And before that, it had been as high as like 19-20% to curb the inflation of the 1970s and 80s. And so, we are still far below 7% interest rate. To my parents seemed like, wow, that is so amazing that you got that. When my wife and I bought our house and we were able to get sub 3, I mean, it was just mind blowing. That's basically free money. Right. But the problem with free money is that you make it possible for people who shouldn't be borrowing free money to borrow it at, really easily and buy assets that they have no business, not even assets, just buy big capital purchases that they have no business owning, that don't actually continue to generate any value. So, yeah, this is a little dip. The reason they might lower it or they've stopped is because they want to make people feel good for a little bit leading into election season. That's all. It's purely
Yeah.
cynical.
Well, and the last thing I'll say is his last little quip. I don't want that to go unchallenged on account for. Despite unemployment close to historic low, um, that's also inaccurate and false. Funny enough, the podcast I was talking about earlier on marriage actually mentioned how men right now, specifically, are at depression era levels of
No
unemployment.
way.
But the reason why it doesn't show up is because most have just stopped looking for work.
They stop reporting it. Yeah.
Yep. And so men specifically, so it's not it is historic. It's just historic in that it's depression era levels of unemployment for men, at least. I don't know. I think women are much more gainfully employed and looking than men in the current culture, actually.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that don't let that fool you. That is not we're not doing fine on unemployment as well.
All right, moving on to our next one. We got Jonathan Casey, and he tweets out, and this is on the kind of the heels of Trump being indicted for the documents case. Quote, first they came for Trump, next they're going to come for you, unquote. He goes, darn, guess I'd better burn all those classified documents I have left over from my stint as president of the United States. What do you think?
This is so unbelievably narrow-minded. Like,
I know.
look, I don't agree with the classical liberal caucus of the Libertarian Party all the time, but I didn't think that they were this like bury your head in the sand. He is the chair of the classical libertarian or classical liberal party of the libertarian or sorry caucus of the Libertarian Party, and that this is just like this to me shows that you are so bought into the corporate media narratives of things without actually looking at what happens, and that you're more comfortable sharing the approved narrative than anything else. There's so many things I could say about this, but first, like, you can think January 6th was stupid. I thought January 6th was stupid. But if you don't see the connection between how, the Patriot Act was, first they're going to go for terrorists, then they're going to come for you, like that's an even bigger jump, right? Than saying first they came for Trump, next they're coming for you, right? Saying first they're going for a Middle Eastern guy with a bomb in an airplane crashing into a building, and then they're coming for you. You would think, okay, that is such a far jump. That's ridiculous. But they're using the same law there for the January 6th people. So saying first they came for Trump, next they're coming for you, and mockingly is so colorblind. It's so bafflingly stupid because it's like, yes, because they've already used the Patriot Act against people who supported Trump. They've already done that using laws that were meant for terrorists. So of course, if they're going for Trump, they can come for you next. Like, I mean, shoot, libertarians everywhere supported the movie, The Little Pink House. About the woman who wouldn't sell over the attempts for eminent domain and stuff like that. Like that woman was targeted by the government. She was just an individual. She just had a piece of land. It's so stupid how willfully ignorant he's being about government being punitive against political opponents. And
Yeah.
this is nothing to say of whether or not Trump was justified and classified documents are justified. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
Yeah, yeah. Like he doesn't. You'd have to contend with whether or not he actually is guilty of whatever they're saying. Whether that's actually, from a libertarian standpoint, it's like, well, there should be no classified documents. So it's like, yeah, that's dumb. But it made me think of, like if someone said in the 1920s, like sarcastically, oh, Stalin came for Trotsky and exiled him, now he's gonna come for you. Oh, guess I better be, a leader in the communist revolution, and be it's like, yeah, like Stalin came, expelled Trotsky for treason, and then he proceeded to move on and kill millions and millions of his fellow
Yeah.
Russians for treason, right? So it trickled down, more like a waterfall, all the way down to people. And it turned out it's like, okay, like when someone is willing to treat their chief, political rival as for the political ends as an enemy and then totally destroy them, it's like, okay, well then you better not get in their way, right? That's the lesson to be learned from this. It's not that like, oh, you don't have documents or something like that. It's like, no, Trump to the establishment is a threat. And so therefore we're going to use whatever means necessary to get him out of there. If they had a better mean to get him out of there, if they had better evidence, they had a better situation to get him out of there with, they would have used it. But this is just the most convenient and easy to use one that doesn't also condemn all their other actions. So that's why they're doing it. Don't think for a minute that they wouldn't come after you if you were in the way. That's not to say, you and I, we're not important, right? In the scheme of like Trump and Biden and all these things, like our profile is like tiny and minuscule, and I'm so thankful that it is that way. But let's just say like this type of authoritarianism trickles down, right? To where they're like, well, people who are libertarians that have podcasts whose names are, start with B and also start with D are somehow, enemies of the state. It's like, oh, well, then it does matter to me, right? And the methods that they're using to get Trump will now also apply to us at that time. It's not a matter of like what they're getting him for. It's why they're getting him for it and what methods they're using to get him with. That is really scary. And so it's just silly. Like we have 100 years of history of authoritarians and their methods and what they do and how it affects common people like you and I, after it affects people who are in the elites or kind of higher up, learn from, and he just completely ignores it.
Yeah, I honestly don't
So it's a
I don't
bad
know.
take.
Yeah, it's just a bad take. I think you're totally on the money there. I don't have any more.
Yeah,
It's just so bafflingly dumb.
for a libertarian too, it's like that is
Yeah.
really bad.
Yeah, like I don't think Justin Amash would have this level of idiocy, and he's pretty blue pilled, you know.
Yeah, it's like that's the government's job is to come and get you. Like
Yeah, yeah,
that's all they do. So
exactly.
they get your money, they get your property taxes, they do everything. All right,
Yeah.
moving on to our next one. We've got Nina Turner quote retweeting. So Declaration of Memes posted a meme, and it has Karl Marx and then a Chad basically having a conversation, and Karl Marx says, if a company has profits, they should be forced to share them with the workers. And then the Chad goes, so if there's losses, the workers also have to share them too, right? Pretty funny meme. And Nina Turner quote retweets and replies, "They already do share the losses. They're called layoffs." Dot dot dot. What do you think? Is Nina Turner correct?
Uh, I mean, in a sense, she kind of
Yeah.
is, right? And and it's funny because, um, if a company has profits, they do share them with the workers. It's called raises. Like all of this happens in a free market system already. And you know what happens when an employee doesn't get a raise they deserve is they usually leave and go somewhere else where they can get paid more for the value they're providing. And it's funny because um the idea is that what she's showing inadvertently is that the voluntary system of this kind of reality ends up reflecting economic realities, right? So if there are losses and you have to lay off employees, then
Yes.
that's the reality that you have to do. But if there are profits for the company, there are raises. That's just how things work in the current system, and you're acting as though that's like this grave injustice. But that's just the reality of, like, if you don't have enough profits from your company to give people their pay, then you have to not let people get their pay. Otherwise, you're having that people work for you for free, which is very, very dumb. The other thing is it's showing that, like, this system would be, or the meme is kind of highlighting that the absolutely hilarious and ridiculous idea that you should have automated pay cuts. Like, if the company isn't as profitable as it was the prior year, you should lose 3% of your salary instead of gaining a 3% raise or whatever. Companies generally tend to every year give employees a percentage raise as the company grows. And so if the company doesn't grow, based on sort of a mandatory system, you should also, I guess, institute pay cuts arbitrarily, just based on these numbers, which is silly, and that's not how most companies operate. Now, sometimes companies do decide they have to do pay cuts, but that's to avoid layoffs, and that's a voluntary action. In fact, some companies, the CEOs or the higher people will voluntarily take pay cuts while the company's not doing well, and that's their choice to do that, right? And that's real when a company's leadership chooses to do that. That's awesome. I know, like, Nintendo did that during their hard years because of their console that didn't do so well. The top people chose to take pay cuts, which was super great and awesome. Also voluntary though, right? And so the funny thing is she's trying to illustrate, like, oh man, the evil capitalist system has layoffs, but in reality the alternative would be mandatory pay cuts for everyone, to a point where the entire everyone gets screwed over, no one gets anything, and the entire company still becomes unstable. If you had that mandatory sort of like price, salary cuts, they would call that just as evil and greedy of the corporations. There's no winning in the situation. If it's done voluntarily without government mandates, they say it's evil and wrong. And if it's a mandated system where if you're mandated to share profits and mandated to share losses, well, then that's unfair because the guys at top are controlling everything and the workers are suffering. There's no winning with these people. They will always call and play victim. That's
Yep.
just how they operate.
Yeah, her take is not wrong, right? In like,
Right.
it's just only half the story, which is, yeah, they do share the losses. They're called layoffs. They also share in the profits, which is you have a job and you might get a raise,
Yeah.
within that. If a company is not profitable, indefinitely, there will be no jobs. But if a company is profitable, you will continue to have a job in a way that is the profit being shared with you. You know, we've already talked a lot about the Federal Reserve, but I mean, inequality, all these different things. One, I mean, it's not, inequality is not as big of an issue when everyone's standard of living is being raised. I mean, that's just indisputable. We have virtually eliminated like extreme poverty in the world in the past 60 years, which is just incredible. You should look up a graph of it and just see like how it just nosedives the amount of extreme poverty that's occurred. But even when there is like inequality, it's exacerbated by things like the Federal Reserve, by how they will do things like quantitative easing to purchase company stocks, the way how they loan out money at cheap rates and different things like that. So a lot of like the stock market gets inflated, and then most of like an executive's pay is from stock, and so therefore it's like inflated. People are surprised to know that Jeff Bezos' salary, I'm not sure if it's this true anymore, but I think back in 2015 or 16, we had a guy come into class and was telling us about how Amazon, like Jeff Bezos, paid $80,000 a year, which seems really minuscule compared to the probably one of the largest companies in the world. But most of these CEOs and executives are compensated via stock options, which is what exasperates that wealth inequality. But people like Nina Turner, one, the gap is not as big as they say it is. Two, uh, they have layoffs, but they also keep jobs. But then three, like look at the scale, right? Like so she's trying to make the point that companies are just getting fat and rich and not sharing any of their profits with their consumers. And so when you look at a corporation like Walmart, you're like, oh yeah, they made $4 billion last year. $4 billion with a B is more money than you or I will ever see in our lifetime, more than probably anyone we know will ever see in their lifetime. But when you scale out $4 billion in profit over the 2 million workers that they've got, it's like, yeah, you can't really afford to do any sort of raises, right? When you scale it across that, I think it equates to something like 80 cents or something like that extra an hour per worker that they've got. If they were to totally distribute and wipe out every single dollar of profit that they make in a year on $400 billion in revenue. So it's like, yeah, like that sounds like $4 billion is a lot, but in reality, what that can do at the scale that Walmart operates at, it can't actually really improve anyone's life, right? So even sharing all of the profits that a company has would eventually lead to there being no jobs at all for those 2 million people. Would you rather make, whatever it is, I think it's $11 an hour here in Washington State for folks working at Walmart? Would you rather, receive that or receive, sorry, $11.80 an hour and potentially lose your job in a year, or just not have a job at all? And it's like, well, I think it's pretty clear. Like all these companies will work and function in the way that best retains their people and best functions, and then the companies that aren't doing that, managers, executives, will leave, or if they can never figure it out, the company just goes under at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last thing I'll add is just that, like, the other aspect is that employees who work longer and provide skills and benefits, they get training in such a way and they gain experience that if even if they don't get a raise in the same job they are, they have the ability for promotions, and those people can climb and get more of the profits as they are providing more value. So those things do go hand in hand in many of the cases. A more profitable company generally is going to have more skilled employees that are able to create more value in a more efficient way, and when you do that, you climb up those ranks in most cases, and will get higher compensation for the added value that you can provide.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's if you work 10% more hours, you make 30% more in
Yeah.
income from your job, which is just a
Yeah.
crazy stat. All right, moving on to our last one. We've got the New York Times, and they are tweeting out an article that they wrote. It's got a quote about from Cheryl Hines, who is, I believe, she's the wife of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
That's correct. That's
So
correct.
her quote is, before this, really, my world was just about comedy, so I could make light of things. But now I understand people are listening in a different way, and I know that it's really important to them. And the New York Times headline writes, Cheryl Hines, Cheryl Hines, the Curb Your Enthusiasm actress, is beloved in Hollywood. Now she's supporting the presidential campaign of her husband, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Is she normalizing his often dangerous ideas? What do you think?
This take made me laugh out loud. Now, there's obviously the aspect of normalizing his dangerous ideas, which is just funny and laughable. But the thing that made me laugh more personally was, I can't believe it. This person is supporting their spouse's presidential run.
Yes.
That is so unbelievably funny to me because it is just so on its face stupid. Like, yeah, what do you expect? Do you think that she would not? This is funny because you know that in every other case, the the Times would be saying, like, oh, it's so noble how much, like Michelle Obama has gone out of her way to support her husband's presidency, or like, the kids and the families have put in so much to support their husband. But in this case, they're like, what? She's supporting him because he has ideas we don't like? That seems unreasonable. And so that just to me is the first thing that cracked me up. We can obviously say more about the dangerous ideas, but I couldn't let the Times get away with this because it is just so unbelievably stupid.
Yeah, it made me. I like what you're saying. Like, oh, how crazy that she supports her husband, who she's been happily married to, for however long it is. It made me think of though that they've normalized. I think Kellyanne Conway and her husband. I can't remember his name, but basically Kellyanne Conway, obviously advisor to Donald Trump, and then her husband, whatever, Will Conway, I think was his name, very
Hmm.
anti-Trump, and they would just publicly feud about this all the time. And the media was like, wow, like how principled is this guy that he'll even go against his wife in this
Yeah.
way? And it's just like, oh, that's just so cringe and awful and ugly. And if my marriage was threatened, uh, if I was on either side of it, by who I politically followed, I'd be like, well, I think I'm just done with politics for the day. I think that's the sign of a healthy marriage would be to be like, well, this is something that's not as important as us having being able to get along together, not publicly humiliate each other. So yeah, of course she's going to support her husband. I mean, you think about Melania Trump. I don't think she was very thrilled that Donald Trump actually got into the White House. There are reports of her crying on election day when he won, not because she was happy, but because she realized she was in for 4 more years of what had transpired over the past year with her
Right.
husband. He was supposed to comfortably lose, and that was their opinion. But regardless, she sucked it up and she's like, all right, I'm going to continue to support him. As I think any spouse in that position kind of that cares about their spouse is going to do. So this just kind of highlights the breakdown of our understanding of what relationships are supposed to be and like the priorities that they're supposed to keep. Like the New York Times is like, no, like the ideology is the most important
Yeah.
part. You got to loyalty to the ideology above all. Like, how could this beloved Hollywood actress, support her vaccine denying anti-vax husband? It's like, well, no, maybe she thinks that stuff too, man. Like, people tend to marry people and then they kind of become the same person in a lot of ways if they have a good marriage. They hold a lot of common ground beliefs, and they bounce off of each other and they spend most of their time together. And so it's inevitable that things rub off. So maybe this beloved Hollywood actress, how dare her hold some of the same beliefs as her husband.
Yeah, I mean, and also the funny thing is like this isn't, about like Trump, right? This is about a pretty classical Democrat in many ways, someone who is skeptical of foreign intervention, is strong on free speech, and yeah, I mean, but he's also like very big on like climate stuff, and he's not like this existential threat, but the problem is he's an existential threat because he's not like as out of it as Biden is. And so he's, they want to shut down every avenue possible for him to have any chance whatsoever. So I thought it was very, very funny.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good. I don't have any more on it. It is.
No.
I remember seeing this, and I was like, "Ah, that's just so weird." Like, I thought, like, why are they quoting? Because they even use her. They don't use her Kennedy last name, right?
Right,
Like,
right.
I
Because
mean, I
yeah,
know
it's
she's
her
known
acting
as
name.
Cheryl Hines or whatever, but still, I just thought that was. I was like, why are they talking about this gal that has no relation to Kennedy? Oh, like halfway down the paragraph, it's like her husband,
Yeah.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Yeah,
So
it's a shock that she would, possibly support him. Like like, oh my gosh. We're all aghast.
yeah. All right. If you're good, I'm good.
I'm good.
Cool. Awesome. Well, friends, thanks for hanging out with us for this show, and we will catch you on the next one.